Building a Stuart 504 boiler plant, Part 4, making the special water tank for the live steam injector. I've been up to Blackgates Engineering and bought some brass sheet and some copper tubing. I already had the top copper tube, but I needed to buy a shorter piece of copper tubing that was a larger diameter than the top part, and once this piece of copper tubing is soldered to the base, this will form the overflow tank to catch the overflow from the injector. And after I've fitted a drain pipe to this bottom tank, I'll be able to pipe the drain to a bucket on the floor. So as the injector is working, there will not be water all over the bench. Both the base and this second piece of brass sheet are 3 mm thick, and this brass sheet is going to be cut to make the lid and the base of the tank itself. The tank needs to be elevated, so there's always water above the injector. In this clip, I'm marking the length that I need for the central column that supports the main water tank. I've made a mark on the brass bar using a felt tip pen, and now it's over to the metal cutting bandsaw to cut it to length. I've had this bandsaw for many years, and to be perfectly honest, it was never good quality, but I can't say too much about it that's bad, because over 30 years later it still works fine. The sheet metal stand that this thing sits on is very frail, and I've often thought about making a new stand, but until this one breaks I don't think I'll bother. I never like wasting time, so I'm not just going to sit about while the bandsaw's doing its stuff. I'm going to machine the larger diameter piece of copper, which forms the tank that will catch the water from the injector, on the larger of my two lathes I have in the workshop. This one is fitted with a 4-jaw self-centering chuck, and in this clip I'm turning the chuck by hand and using a deburring tool to remove the edge that the cutting tool's left. Once I machine both ends of the piece of copper tubing, I refitted it in the chuck with the jaws on the inside of it so I could use a piece of emery cloth to clean up the outside. I'm using an old belt from my 1-inch belt sander to do this. And in the time that it took to machine the copper tubing, the bandsaw cut the piece of brass to the right size, and it's currently being machined in my Boxford lathe to the correct length. Now when I hold the parts in position, you should get the idea of what this is going to look like. But there's quite a long way to go yet. First of all, I need to make the base. I place the piece of copper tubing on the brass sheet, draw around that, and in this clip I'm using a square to mark out the finished size. And then once again it's over to the bandsaw to cut this piece. This bandsaw really is very useful because it allows me to cut sheet metal as well. I did have a guillotine, but I sold that as I never used it. In this clip I'm checking that the centre column is the correct length by placing a ruler across the top of the tank and the column itself. And now it's time to machine the brass bar. I could have left the brass bar as it was, just plain, but I don't like to see bar stock on a model in its original unfinished state. It's not difficult to do some fancy machining on it, and the machining really isn't very fancy. But when it looks like this, it looks more Industrial Revolution, but leaving the bar in its plain unfinished state just makes it look very poor. It's a bit mad really, because when this part's in place you'll hardly be able to see it, and I'm being very careful not to weaken it too much. If I make it too thin, then the upper tank would wobble about, and I don't want this to happen. With the semi-ornamental turning completed, I can try it in position. I've threaded one end only, and I'll show you why later on in the next video. And now when I put my steel ruler on the top of the column, you get the general idea of what it's going to look like. The next parts to make are the bases. I'll start off with the tank base. The other piece of brass sheet that I bought is going to make the tank base and the tank cap, but I'm not too bothered about the cap yet. I'm making the base first. And once again, yes, I do realise that it's very unengineering-like, but I'm drawing around the brass tube with a felt tip pen, and so I know what this is. I'm writing the word base on it. I need to cut this piece of 3 mm brass sheet to start with, so mark out the size, and once again it's over to the bandsaw. Just as a matter of interest, I did change the blade on the bandsaw because the previous blade was not too good after I cut all the stainless steel from the last part of the project. And in no time at all this happens. Nothing like a new blade. It's far sharper than the old one, and it goes through this sheet metal at a good speed. Although if I want to be picky, I'm not too thrilled with the join on this new blade. It's a little bit lumpy, which from my experience generally means it won't last long, so I think I'll take it back to Blackgates and get another one. But for the moment it's only cutting brass, so it's going to be okay. That's the main tank base cut to the right size. Well, almost. I do have to trim it around the edge to make it circular. What I'm doing at the moment is drilling a hole in the middle of it, first of all with a centre drill and then with a 1/4 inch diameter twist drill. You will notice that I'm holding this part in the vise on the drilling machine because it's much safer than holding it in my hands. And after the hole had been drilled in the centre, I used the bandsaw in the vertical position to allow me to get it approximately round. This brass part is going to fit inside this tube, but unlike the bottom tank, I didn't put this copper tube in the lathe to clean it up to the right size. Instead, I used my 4-inch belt sander. And it's surprisingly easy using a belt sander to get the edge perfectly square. All you do is sand it with the belt sander and then check it with a square like this. Squaring off copper tubing this way is surprisingly simple to do, but you do need to practice before you get it 100% correct. Now it's time to machine this piece of brass to fit inside the tube. And for this I'm using a 1/4 inch bolt tightly fastened to the piece of brass, which will then go in the chuck. But the chuck will hold the bolt by the nut, not by the threads. I've speeded up this section because it's a very simple operation and I didn't see the need to go into great precision detail about it. I'm not machining all the way down, I'm leaving a bit of a lip on this so that it locates on the brass tubing. And once the part is machined to the correct size, a quick touch with the file cleans it up, and it's a nice fit now in the copper tubing. This brass cap is going to be soft soldered into the end of the copper tube, so it's quite important not to make the brass cap too tight to fit because you want the solder to flow between the copper and the brass itself. To be perfectly honest, I really don't need to tap this into place at all, but I do like using my copper-faced hammer. Now it's into the outer part of the workshop, I'm spreading some flux around the joint, and I'm about to solder the brass base in position. First of all, I need to get the piece of copper hot enough. Not too hot as to cremate the solder, just hot enough for a good soft soldered joint. I'm also using resin cord electrical solder to solder this, which I find to be perfectly adequate. All I need to do now is to leave the part to cool naturally in the air. And the next part to make is the base. And once again, the first thing I'm going to do is drill a hole in the centre of the base. And why am I using a centre punch and not a centre drill? That's because I'm going to use a compass and I need somewhere to put the point. And first of all I set it to 2 inches, which gives me the 4 inches diameter for the accurate positioning of the copper tank. And then by increasing the distance between the 2 points of the compass, I can describe an arc on the corners of the piece of metal. And by positioning a ruler across the corner points, not forgetting to allow for the thickness of the felt tip pen itself, I make a mark on each of the arcs. And these are the positions for the mounting holes. The next part of the job is to finish the copper tank. The soldering was successful and the part has cooled. It's now mounted in the 3-jaw chuck in the Boxford lathe, and it's held in the chuck by the external part of the jaws, and at the other end it's supported by a live centre. And by using a combination of filing and wet to dry sandpaper I get the finish that I require. Back now to the base. I've drilled the holes in the corners for the mounting bolts. Here's the support column, followed by the copper tubing that forms the drain tank, and finally the main tank sits on top of the column. This is where the water tank is going to fit on the steam plant itself. The bottom part is going to be painted black to match everything else on the plant, and the upper tank is going to be left in polished copper. In the next episode I'll be finishing this special tank, fitting the injector and piping it up. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching and I hope you found it useful.